Welcome to the All About Us podcast, the show where we explore the stories, ideas, and inner worlds that shape how we live together on this planet. I'm your host, Carl Allen. Today's guest is someone who brings heart, science, and insight to one of the most urgent conversations of our time. Leslie Davenport is an internationally recognized climate psychology educator, consultant, and therapist. She works where climate, emotion, and social systems meet, helping people understand how our internal landscapes mirror the changing world around us. She's the author of Emotional Resiliency in the Era of Climate Change for Clinicians, as well as All the Feelings Under the Sun and What Do We Do When Climate Change Scares You for your younger audiences. Her upcoming Climate Emotions Workbook from the American Psychological Association will be released later in 2026. Leslie also leads the Climate Psychology Certification Program at the California Institute of Integral Studies and advises organizations such as the Post Carbon Institute and One Resilient Earth. Leslie, thank you for being here today. Let's begin. This is a mouthful here. You
Yes,
have quite a bit going on.
I do. I do. Thank you so much for having me. I'm looking forward to this conversation.
One of the most interesting things that I'm kind of intrigued by is how you're integrating climate change with emotional well-being and psychology. Can you go into that a little bit?
Yes, yes. So that really does kind of get to the heart of my work. And I start with just acknowledging that as we witness, directly experience, learn about climate impacts, right? More wildfires, floods, heat, all kinds of things. We naturally are reacting to that. It's how we're wired, whether it's fear or anger that something isn't being done about it, sadness at the losses that are happening in the biodiversity and cultures and communities. And so it starts with knowing that any and all of these feelings are a natural response to what's happening. That's the starting point. And if we don't acknowledge that or we push them aside or think there's something wrong with us, the feelings tend to amplify. And we either sort of drop out of being involved in climate change because it's too overwhelming or we feel powerless, or we get so distressed that it affects our ability to function. What's happening in the world affects us. How we are with each other and how we view the world around us affects our emotions and affects the environment. So they really aren't separate. They're always influencing and in communication with each other.
Okay. How did your path towards climate psychology begin? What drew you to explore the emotional side of climate change?
Yes. Okay. Well, I've been a licensed and practicing psychotherapist for almost 35 years. And prior to focusing on climate, I worked in health psychology. I worked in a hospital in San Francisco. And it was about looking at how we can participate in our own healing. How do our thoughts and emotions play a part along with the best in medical interventions and everything else? And so I was steeped in an interdisciplinary approach to healing, looking at crises through different lenses. And at one point, I had my own, what I think of as sort of my climate wake up moment, where things I had been seeing, hearing, reading about just hit home in a very strong way. It shifted from being information to being a very visceral response inside of me. And I made a decision that I wanted to shift everything I could in my personal and professional life to address this. And I did what many people do when that happens, sign petitions or go to demonstrations or look at how I can be part of local legislative efforts. But then I was like, well, what else can I do? Where can I have the most traction, the most leverage? And I realized because this really wasn't being talked about at the time, that so much of what I was already trained in, like breaking through denial, processing grief and complex emotions, helping to facilitate conversations that could be polarizing and helping them to build bridges instead, supporting lifestyle changes. And suddenly this light bulb went off of like all of those things would be so helpful to the climate conversation. So I already had a couple books out related to health psychology, and I approached the publisher and said, this is what I'd like to talk about. This is why I think it's important. And they took a gamble on me and published the book. And since then, it's just been a growing awareness. And I've been invited into all kinds of settings to help work through this aspect of things.
You worked as both a therapist and educator. When did you begin feeling climate related emotions appear in your clinical or classroom work? When did
Mhm.
you begin seeing them appear?
Yeah. Where I really saw it first was in my private practice. So I'm currently living in Washington State, but I used to live in Northern California. We've had some really big wildfires there and still do. And I had a client who lost her entire home to a quick moving wildfire in the Santa Rosa area. And what I realized in what I was aware of, and then seeing firsthand what it was like for her, certainly the devastating losses, but all kinds of decisions that roll out over time in the recovery. Like, should I continue to live in this area I've called my home for many, many years, or is it not a wise decision because it's such a fire-prone area? And not just losing her home, but so many of her local community places. Her neighbors were affected, the cafes she loved were gone. So it was just such a overnight impact of such severe proportions that that's really when I saw it the most. And so when I work in education or other areas, it really varies quite a bit what the impacts have been to the community. Is it something where people are being directly affected by climate? Is it something they're learning about? Is it something where it intersects with other issues like marginalized communities who have been forced to live in areas with higher levels of pollution. For example, I consider all of that connected. So what the needs are in an area, in a school, in a community, really, really are guided by what they're addressing directly.
Now, I want to step back and approach this from a global standpoint. I have a question for you. At what time point globally in your mind, did we go from talking about apparent climate change to actually being in the midst of the climate change war?
Yeah, that is such a hard one to address. I don't know if I can put an exact timeline on it, but there are certainly areas that have been experiencing more severe impacts longer than others. So I think it's really good to have a global view. I'm thinking especially in areas around Pakistan and India where things like the high level of a heat index, repeated flooding, areas that are going to, including the Middle East, become possibly unlivable because of the high level of heat, as well as coastal areas being affected by sea level rise and certain island nations that are projected to have to relocate because the islands are at sea level. And with the rising seas, it's not something that can be managed in a way that they can maintain their homeland.
Yeah, really for me, it's been over the past 5 years. I've just seen and noticed internationally just more hurricanes, more tsunamis, more the high heat decks during in summer, even in Europe and various
Yeah.
different countries over there. So over the past 5 years, for me, that's kind of when the trigger hit. Many people think of climate change as an external crisis. When did you realize that our inner emotional worlds were equally part of the story?
Yes. Well, again, it probably started with my own climate awakening that I described and the way that I felt such a deep emotional wave. But then I've seen it over and over and over in the people I've worked with. So, for example, I've worked with some youth activists who are, right on the front line of trying to create change. And unless they learn how to build in their own self-care and emotional support and collective support, there's a really high level of burnout. We just can't stay in the fight if we're not also stepping back and taking a breath and replenishing ourselves. And I'm seeing this honestly in anyone, in any type of environmental work, whether it's journalists, climate scientists, leaders of nonprofit organizations, where they're with this alarming information all the time. And not necessarily a work culture that acknowledges the impact to our humanity to be wrestling with what many people call an existential crisis. It really is for many areas life and death, and the impacts are on the rise.
What personal experience have shaped how you understand the connection between the human mind and the living earth?
Well, from a personal perspective, the way you asked it, and I will say that I know it's also backed by research, some of it's just noticing the changes of what it's like when I'm in front of my computer all day or when I'm outside in a more wild area. What happens to my thoughts, how my shoulders relax, how I feel calmer inside, how I'm more aware of myself as a person in the context of a larger living system. That sense of being connected to the elements. Just it's simple things that almost sound poetic but are scientific. Like when we breathe in, we're literally breathing in the sky. When we exhale, it's mingling with the plants as well as people. Our breath, there's no borders to the way our breath travels around the globe for everyone. And so to be more in the setting that really supports that awareness and that perception, and I think it really fortifies the best parts of our humanity by understanding our interconnectedness. I think that's a really profound way that I've experienced that. And, luckily, there's a lot of studies behind that. What's it like if you're in green spaces versus not, in terms of stress level and cortisol and, stress chemicals in the body, and a lot of different ways that gets measured.
What I've recently found out in my own experiences, that you can be in the right person in the wrong location. And what I mean by that is I've taken several trips to Puerto Rico. And it's like as soon as I land in San Juan, it's like my life just totally changes, totally transforms to the point that I'm getting ready to relocate there in about a month. But
Oh,
I want to walk on the beach every
yeah.
morning and every night. I spend more time in the water in Puerto Rico than I've spent the rest of my life combined, except from when I was in the military. But it's just a connection, seeing the iguanas, the sea turtles, the different birds, picking up a coconut that's floating onto the beach.
Mm.
All of those experiences, it's kind of like it makes my world explode into 3 or 4 dimensions rather than being this desedimentary type of life that I'm living here.
Beautifully said. Beautifully said.
You often describe our internal landscapes, our thoughts, emotions, nervous systems as reflections of the natural world. Can you share what that means in practice?
Okay.
I ask difficult questions.
The doorway in. Well, it's similar to what you just described about what it's like to be in the water in a place you love. We can talk about that as how it affects our nervous system, how it affects our mental functioning, how it affects our physical health. They're just tied together. And, you know, it's sort of like the environment affects us in the way you're describing, and we affect the environment for better or for worse. So let me try and make this a little more concrete. So let's say we're looking at a tree, and there's so many ways we can be in the presence of a tree. We can look at it as a commodity. Oh, I'm gonna put hardwood floor in my house. So gee, this would be a good tree for that. We can look at it as something of beauty. that inspires us. We can look at it as a place to rest in the shade and sort of take refuge. We can, look at us at it as something that stabilizes the earth, cleans the air, and is a community benefit. And the reason it can have all of those features and more has to do with the lens through which we're perceiving it, the lens through which we're looking at it. So, our I think that our predominant industrialized Western world looks at a lot of things as commodities, looks at things sort of chopped up, doesn't recognize that interconnectedness and health that's required for our air. Healthy air requires, affects a healthy body. And I think reconnecting all those things in terms of understanding what already exists that we've lost the ability to perceive directly is part of what we need to work on as we look toward climate change solutions. Does that
How does our mental and emotional health change when we feel disconnected from nature?
Mhm, mhm. Well, I've heard described again, and I'm thinking predominantly of industrialized Western world, that there's an epidemic of loneliness. So I think one of the things it does is makes us feel isolated, alone, powerless, especially in the face of climate change and other large, difficult threats we're all navigating in our world these days. If we're cut off from nature and also cut off from each other, we tend to recede in this sort of weakened, depressed state. It's not unusual. Or people go the other way and they just get really riled up, angry, lashing out without it necessarily, it might be understandable, but it may not likely be productive. But I think when we co regulate with our natural environment, connect with each other, take a more community oriented approach, it has huge benefits to, again, just embodying our humanity, feeling more empowered, more agency, and helping to create a safer, healthier world, which I think just about everybody wants.
Correct. How does our mental and emotional health change when we feel? I asked that question. So I did ask that question. Can you talk about the body's role in this relationship and how our nervous system responds to the state of the planet?
Mhm, mhm. Well, again, sometimes when I'm giving a talk to a group, I'll say, "How many of you here have been affected directly by climate change?" And, a few hands will go up. And what usually comes to mind for people is I've experienced an evacuation, I've experienced a loss due to an extreme weather event. But then I go on to explain that there's different types. That would be direct impacts. There's also what we might call indirect impacts, things like maybe your house didn't burn down, but you've lived through smoky skies because of a wildfire in a neighboring area, which can have a big impact on health, can cancel kids' sporting events. I mean, all kinds of things, right? And then there's also other impacts that people don't always recognize are connected. So, for example, when it's hotter than we're used to and hotter than we're comfortable in, there's an increase in aggression and violence in the community. There's higher levels of suicide attempts and visits to the hospital, especially among adolescents. And there's a rise in domestic violence. And so people might not even realize these impacts are happening. And then there's a third level of impact that we call just vicarious, which is maybe you live in an area that is, for now, feeling somewhat protected by direct impacts, but you're sure reading about it, and you might know somebody else, a relative or a friend in the different part of the country or the world who's really struggling. And so, from an empathetic place and from a kind of looking at what does this mean for us, there can be distress. So usually after I go through direct, indirect, and vicarious impacts, just about every hand in the room will go up of yes, I can relate to one of those. So our nervous systems are sort of like a monitor of what's happening in our thoughts and feelings. If let's step away from climate change for a moment and just think about you have to have a difficult conversation with someone. Maybe, you're anticipating an argument. And if you had the right equipment, you could measure how your nervous system is stirred up, that the stress response is kicking in, even in anticipation. Your heart rate can change, your blood pressure can change, your palms might get sweaty, there's tension in your muscles. And then the opposite happens too when you're in that ocean in Puerto Rico and on the beach. All of that shifts. And so it's like this ongoing communication between what I think of as our inner world and our outer world. They're just not as clear cut and separate as we think they are.
So, what is the overall purpose of the work that you do? Or is it
Mhm.
multifaceted?
Yes, well, it definitely has a lot of facets, a lot of features, but I would say that ultimately it's helping us grow the capacity to bear witness to the suffering and difficulties that we're all facing to varying degrees, depending on a lot of factors. Develop the resources to support ourselves and each other, and the clarity and agency to be part of change. Because climate change is systemic, it's complex, it's woven into political issues and economic issues and societal structures and all kinds of things. And so it's easy for people to feel like, I can't do anything. I don't have a role to play. Here I am, powerless and terrified and furious, whatever it may be. So it's working with that stance of, I can't do anything and I'm frozen in these big feelings, to let's work with the feelings. They are big and they're there for a reason. And there's lots of good tools to help manage that and soothe your nervous system so that together we can create a clear vision of how to join together for change. I think of it as tending our inner landscapes so that we can tend our outer ones.
Okay. You use the term ecological self. How would you describe it to someone hearing it for the first time?
Oh boy, I wish I had practiced some of these. Okay. It's connected to, and then I'll see if I can just condense it into a simple statement. It's connected to what I've been talking about of we're not really separate from the air that we breathe. The food that we eat is made up of sunlight and water that flows through rivers and earth, and literally the minerals that were in the soil that are part of the rocks become part of our bones. So it's recognizing that we're not separate from what we call nature. We tend to say, we should spend time in nature. I love nature, or I'm frightened of nature. Some people who've grown up totally in urban environments are uncomfortable in the wilds, I have to say. But we have this view of this thing outside of us. So, an ecological self is recognizing that we are the earth and the health of the earth is a reflection of the health of us. And our health is reflected on how we treat each other and the world around us.
You know
And
what is, I didn't
yeah,
mean to interrupt you.
that's
It
okay.
sounds a lot like the holistic approach to life that many indigenous populations have. They believe that we have a spirit. They believe that the rocks have a spirit. The trees and plants have a spirit. We look at some things as being inanimate when they really aren't. They're all living, all part of this life cycle here on this earth.
That makes tremendous sense to me. I mean, I can't claim any insider knowledge about indigenous practices, but I certainly resonate with everything that you've just said, and it does align with what I try to share and teach in my work too.
In your view, how does cultivating an ecological self help us move from fear towards care and responsibility?
Mhm, mhm. Well, moving towards care is sort of an easy one because, again, if we look at the world around us as part of us and we are part of that, in the same way we attend to ourselves, if we're attending to the world around us, it's an easy extension. So the caring is easy. the fear is challenging because there's, in spite of our own efforts, our own perceptions, there's a lot of other forces at play, right? That can feel outside of our control, like those who are damaging the environment, damaging those parts, we could say those extended parts of ourselves. And there's no way around riding the waves of grief and fear and frustration and anger at that happening. But it doesn't have to stop us. It can be motivators for, again, being part of change. There's not a simple path. But one thing I do try and do is for people who are saying, well, how can I make a difference? So there are these big, complex systems in place. Given that every aspect of human activity, every endeavor, every institution needs to re examine itself in terms of sustainability and impact, that means that wherever you're working and living, there's already a place for you to work on this. So, for example, if you're a school teacher, how can you introduce this into the classroom? Maybe you have an after school green club for kids who want to come up with projects about lowering the carbon footprints at the school and lowering waste. Or if you're an artist, one of the most powerful forms of expression, sometimes more powerful than a speech, how can your art be part of communicating things about the beauty of the world, the harm we're doing, and hope? If you work in the medical world, can you start a waste reduction initiative? I mean, if you're a parent, how can you attend to your children growing up in this world and have open conversations that it matters to you, that you can be in this together to work to create a better future ahead? So there's so many ways to be involved. I mean, the downside is how complex the system is. The upside is that all of those channels are ways for us to be involved.
How many cultures have you had any experiencing, excuse me, had any experience in kind of absorbing or interacting with besides your own culture?
It's been somewhat limited, primarily been here, and consultations in person and remotely in Romania, so Eastern Europe, in Italy, not directly professionally, but I've put myself for a period of time in Africa and South America, more to observe than to teach. So I'm very interested in that, but my work has primarily been in the US.
The reason why I asked you that, because I'm going to follow up with this question. How do different cultures express their relationship with nature from your observation? And what can Western societies learn from those perspectives?
Well, I wanna be a learner, honestly. I do have a limited and intuitive sense of how much more not only a close relationship with nature, a respectful one with a lot of understanding, but also cultures that value some of the capacities that are minimized here, like intuition, other ways of knowing, what our body can tell us in terms of information and not just our thinking mind. I believe there's a tremendous amount there, um, and I would love to find a way to be a part of building some of those bridges. So if you have any ideas, let me know.
Okay. For someone raised in the industrialized setting where nature often feels distant,
Yeah.
what are some ways to rebuild this connection with nature?
Yeah, no, that's beautiful. And I do work with that some. Even if for whatever reason a person is limited access to what we think of as the wilds of nature, just opening a window. If we direct our attention, our interest, our curiosity, our focus, look at the sky, feel into the vastness, notice the breeze, notice the sounds. It's a place to start right there. So even if it's a small patch of earth at a community pocket garden or a backyard or a schoolyard, there are places to connect directly. And some of it, again, is as simple as noticing and moving from the emphasis on a thinking mind to a sensing our body in relationship to the natural elements. There's other simple ways of planting things indoors, whether it's an herb garden in the kitchen, a simple house plant, just things where you can even witness and be part of nurturing that cycle of growth and what happens with life. And noticing how you feel when you even explore these little things. It can even be as simple as knowing that when you turn on the faucet, that water, we don't think about it. That water seems kind of like magic. It just comes out of a faucet. But that's the same water that flows through rivers, that flows through oceans, that's part of rain. But we don't make those larger connections.
That water can be 2 billion years old.
That's right. That's right. And all the places it's been, right? Everything about that. Yes.
You said that social justice and climate justice are inseparable.
Yeah.
Inequality and environmental breakdown intersect emotionally and socially.
Yeah. Well, the foundational part is that the areas, and I'm speaking globally now, but we could also look at it regionally. The areas that are experiencing the largest impacts from climate change, floods, fires, are generally the ones least responsible for putting carbon in the atmosphere that's creating these impacts and usually have the fewest resources to rebuild. So that's the foundation of the fundamental injustice. So that when we look at, I keep talking about making change, being part of transformation, that needs to come into the equation as we make decisions on any level. And I'll give a simple one that puts us back, in US communities. So a lot of cities, towns, and communities are starting tree planting initiatives to bring more green space into their community. So the question becomes, so are those trees actually being planted in the areas that need them the most? Right? So we see that question about injustice, access can come up on any level. Really common one. We don't want more trees going to the areas with the most trees. We want it going to the areas that are lacking that. So that would be a simple way to make sure that those questions get asked as solutions are being put forward on any level, local, state, global, national.
And this is an interesting area for me because I actually have several nonprofits. My main nonprofit, which is this podcast, is an outreach of a Stand Up and Do Something, which is a social justice nonprofit. But I also have another nonprofit called the Acacia Tree Foundation.
Oh.
And that is something that's really, I'm going to really start for the next 2 years because the acacia tree is such a transformative plant. You can plant acacia trees in an area that has undergone desertification. And within a 4 or 5 year period, that the acacia trees will totally transform that environment. The
Mm.
tree has the ability to send roots down 30, 40, 50, 60 feet until it hits the water table and then just transforms the environment. I've seen areas that were totally desert, and in 5, 6 years, you see rivers and streams developing, birds, all
Wow.
type of animals coming back to that environment. And so it's something that, I mean, really, we need to connect with, and we need to understand that yes, we did some destruction to this, but how do we change that? How do we flip all of that around?
Yes, love hearing that. That is fantastic.
Now, how can therapists, educators, and community leaders make health part of climate action, especially in marginalized communities?
Yes. Well, that is one of the areas I'm trying to work in. I started out training other mental health professionals like, look, I can see all these connections. There's so much we can offer. You do it too. Here's how you do it. Because unfortunately, there's no required training yet for any level of mental health professional related to climate and climate distress, whether it's a counselor, a psychiatrist, a psychologist, a social worker. If they are knowledgeable, it's because they've sought it out on their own. It's not yet infused into the training. So I've been trying to bring that forward. And then I started working with schools because it's certainly not true across the board, but some schools are introducing public schools climate curriculum as a science subject, but not with any kind of social emotional support. So kids are getting the news about glaciers and polar bears and all the stuff without anything of what to do with that information, how to make a difference, honoring the feelings that arise. So we've been replicating what happens to us as adults when we get a lot of bad news, bad news, bad news on the news, and then, okay, see you tomorrow. So how to support kids as this information and impacts are happening. And then working with nonprofit staff who are trying to do the work but having trouble with the features of burnout. So honestly, one of my next areas is to bring it into more of a public health domain. So, you know, when someone goes into to see a nurse, a physician, that it can be part of the questions. They ask about aches and pains and stress and whatever else may be part of your history. So to include an intake question about when you hear about climate change or the state of the world, how's it affecting you? Well, welcome it into the conversation. The other thing I'm really promoting, especially when I do training with the mental health professionals, is breaking out of this idea of it all happens one on one in a closed little room. And how can we bring it out into the community? So, suggestions have come up for things like what if there's just a free drop in chat group, educational group at the YMCA? People may or may not even know it's happening, but they walk by and are curious and go in. It's just already there. Or things that through the library system. Or if people are in a book club to read a book related to climate change, but start with the breath practice that is soothing to the nervous system to just get freaking creative about how to bring what we know into settings. It's not that hard.
Okay. Can healing collective trauma also help heal our relationship with the planet itself?
Oh, it's gotta be collective. It's gotta be collective. I mean, that's the other thing too, I was saying, it's so chopped up here in the industrialized West, and we're very hyper individualistic. So shifting to this more community-based, communal, we're in this together, we can't do it without each other model, I think is absolutely essential.
Okay. Now I'm going to shift gears. I'm going to go into emotional resilience and creativity.
Yeah.
Okay. Echo anxiety and grief are real for many people. How can we stay emotionally open without being overwhelmed?
Yeah. Yeah. So there's a concept I wanna describe. It comes out of trauma research and trauma work. Some people may be familiar with it. It's called the window of tolerance, sometimes called the zone of resilience. And the idea is if it's drawn, it's kind of drawn like two parallel lines. And in between is us going through a day or a week where it's a stressful moment, and then we have a quieter moment, and then there's a lot to do. But if we move outside of our zone of resilience where we're more or less managing okay all the things that are on our plate, there's a thing that happens where literally parts of our brain begin to shut down and we move into a reactive state. We become overwhelmed and we either check out, which is isolating, stonewalling, could move towards substance abuse or self harm, just really withdrawing because it's too much. Or we'd go into hyper arousal, which is lashing out, angry in its most extreme forms, could move into violence. So, using that model, part of it is helping people become aware of where those edges are. Like, how are you feeling if it was a 0 to 10 stress scale? How do you recognize if you're going from a 6 to a 7 to an 8 to a 9? And what can you do to consciously step back or connect with another person or take a walk around the block or whatever tools are going to be helpful for you? Turn on music so that you don't get overwhelmed and so that you can better manage and understand your own fluctuations and the edges of your ability to tolerate whatever is happening. The good news here, not only is that there are great tools to do that, but our window of tolerance isn't fixed. It can stretch. So the more we learn, uh, let's say breath practices for self-soothing our nervous system, or we've got better community support, which is tremendous. We do what's called co-regulate with each other. So if your nervous system is in a calmer state than mine, just chatting together will often be calming for me. So we offer that to each other. So that's another reason why the community support is really, really vital. It's growing that awareness, learning the tool, and then not only self-regulating, but co-regulating with each other.
You often emphasize creativity and imagination in your work. How do they help us navigate fear or despair about the future?
Yeah. I love this topic, partly because I've been around a while on this planet before before I was doing psychotherapy. I had a first career as a modern dancer. So I have a real love of the arts. I have a love of movement and what it's like to dance and what happens when we're tapped into a more creative state of mind. And one reason I think it's essential is especially when we're racked with fear around climate change or other threats, our solutions can look really small. Like, well, it's kind of like rearranging the furniture in the house. Well, if I move the couch over here, is that going to be better? But what I think we need to do is think outside that box, is to think even if we haven't experienced it yet, what might be possible? And then we can try and see if there's a way to map a practical road to that. And that ability to think outside what we know is to have the imaginative capacity, the creative capacity. And it is one of those things that I do believe is very inherent to being human, but has been kind of shut down in our Western culture.
Okay, you've written both for children and adults. What differences have you noticed in how each group responds to the emotional realities of climate change?
Mhm. Well, one thing that's so fun about especially younger kids is that imaginative capacity is already there. It hasn't been totally shut down yet. So it's really a joyful experience for even if they're just doing simple drawings about, what they're worried about and what a healthier world would look like. Most kids can just jump right in. Or, if it's something about reconnecting with nature or cultivating the love of the natural world, they have no problem making a mask out of a paper plate and then enacting being, a lion or a rat or whatever they choose. And so that's a very joyful thing. So, there's just a lot of developmental stages when we talk about kids. So, just loosely speaking, I'll say that kids up to the age of about 6, and this is, of course, very fluid, but just have a love and curiosity of the world. They can't conceptualize some of the struggles that we are talking about in this conversation, but they wanna know why there's rainbows and how to make a seed grow into a plant, and are curious that if you are taking a shower and you learn that you're sharing that same water, like we talked about with the faucet, with plants and animals outside and other people. It's like, "Oh," and so to cultivate, as people, we tend to want to protect what we love. So if you're cultivating that love of animals and the natural world and our communities, that's going to support them in being good stewards as they get older.
Go ahead. I'm sorry. It's interesting when you talk about children because what came to mind is I think it was a television show that it said children say the darndest things.
Mhm.
And I don't know, you're this expert in this. What I've been told is children can't how would I say it, like mentally think. Like they can't talk to themselves or mentally rationalize things until they get like 8, 9, or 10 years old. So a
Mhm.
lot of their problem solving or figuring things out is they actually have to say it. They actually have to speak it. They don't have the ability to actually reason things out without speaking. That's what I'm told. You're the expert.
I think there's a lot of truth to that, and that the role of caregivers, community, schools, providing outlets for that is really important. Because one of the things that happens is that parents or caregivers, out of the desire to not scare their kids, or they don't know what to say if they get questions about climate change, kind of make it a taboo subject. It's like, well, let's kinda not talk about this because I don't know and I'm scared. But then kids are left kinda in their own confusion and their own feelings. They might get a little fragment of information that's inaccurate, like maybe the TV's on and they see a fire, but they don't know it's in a whole other state, and they go to bed. That's literally kinds of things that can happen. Yeah. So for parents to know that they don't have to have all the answers, but they can open it up. I'm really interested in what you wanna learn about, what your questions are, how you're feeling, and we'll figure this out together because it matters to me too. That's such a helpful stance.
What practices, whether art, mindfulness, or community connection, have you found most helpful in building emotional resilience? Excuse me.
Yeah. Well, I love this question because I really like to help people discover what works best for them. And there's a few things that kind of across the board. Like, so I'm always big on learn a couple breath practices because you can do it anywhere, doesn't cost anything. Your breath is always with you. It's just easy. But one person might get a lot of benefit from doing yoga or something quiet and reflective, but the next person's gonna need to do kickboxing. Oh, it's just like, well, what are those things that feel best to you that when you do them, you feel yourself kind of coming back home to yourself, back in your body, a clearer state of mind. And there's such a broad spectrum. One of my favorite stories is a 13-year-old girl who we were working on this, and her answer was skateboarding. And she said, when I'm skateboarding, and I'm kind of paraphrasing it, but she was describing how she has to really be in her body, she has to really be in the moment, and she has to really be attuned to her environment because she doesn't want to hit a pothole or a pebble. And I'm like, if I didn't know that was skateboarding, I would call that mindfulness meditation. Right, but I can't be the person saying, "Well, just skateboard," because it's gonna be, different for everybody.
You lead the climate psychology certification program at the California Institute of Integral Studies.
Yeah.
What do you hope your students carry into the world from that training?
Yes. So it's because as I mentioned, at this point there is no training in any mental health program. It's primarily for the mental health field. It's set up as a continuing education certificate program to learn how to support people who come into a therapeutic setting, whether it's one-on-one or some kind of a group or community setting. Because what has happened without climate literacy, climate distress practices. Unfortunately, clients have gone in for support and come out worse because a therapist who's not knowledgeable just ends up communicating that they're making too big a deal out of it, right? Or this is generalized anxiety versus starting with a validation of, boy, I get it why you're so upset as you read about, experience this climate concern, or as you glance into your future as a young person and don't know what this world is going to look like. Let's start there. So that's the starting point is just validation, welcoming more conversation. And therapists aren't trained or prepared to even do that. So that's that's what that program is mostly about. It's also open to what we call allied health professionals, so coaches, nurses, school teachers, there's others who come as well.
What has surprised you about the kinds of emotions or insight people discover during the program?
The thing I hear over and over that I guess at this point is not as big of a surprise, but they come not only for tools and information, but because they really are craving peer support and a sense of community. Again, this is often doing it on their own. This is all offered online, virtually live. So we do group people together so they can form their own network, so they can stay in touch after the program ends. And that's a lot of what the students want is time with each other in addition to what the faculty bring.
Okay. You've advised many global organizations from your perspective. What gives you hope in how societies are beginning to integrate emotional awareness into climate work?
Well, I mean, to me, the answer sort of in the question, just the fact that it is becoming more understood, how essential that component is, that the awareness is growing, that more and more people, whether they're in the role professionally or just within their community as a citizen, say, this matters to me and I want to be involved. Just the sense of this growing wave of awareness, willingness, and concern, I find probably the most helpful thing, most hopeful.
Well, I'm hoping this podcast show, it seems like we've touched on a lot of things. I'm hoping this podcast show can be a tool to help you bring this awareness and insight because we've talked about a lot of interesting
We sure
areas,
have. Yeah.
inspired it. And how do you envision it supporting both professionals and the public?
Thank you. Yes. So it's the thing that I love. I'm all about the theories, but I'm also a pretty down to earth practical person. And this is a very hands on workbook. So I believe there's 9 chapters. Each chapter has not only information, but a minimum of 3 practices, things to you are in that window of tolerance we talked about before. So what I love is that whether a person picks this up for their own support or whether a teacher takes the practices and applies them in a classroom and says, "Hey, let's all do this together." I feel like the applications are endless. Anyone can pick and choose, do them all, bring them into any setting I can think of. Open a business meeting with one of the practices to begin to bring that emotional support into the all kinds of work settings. So that's what it
Okay. Now we're going into that part of the show called flip mode, where you get to ask me 3 questions.
okay. Okay, I know I thought about this before, but I'm gonna have to be spontaneous here. Well, I've read a little bit about your background, which is pretty vast, military, and then I was hearing about these various nonprofits and things. What have you found for yourself is most helpful when it comes to being grounded, being centered, kind of staying in things when there's high levels of distress?
I would say, and I hate to say it, but I'm more of an isolationist. And what I mean by that is there's one theory I hold to. I don't associate with the unhappy or the unlucky. I don't know if you've read the 48 sources of power. And so that the not the 48 laws of power, excuse me. And that's the 10th law. That's the 10th law. Do not associate with the unhappy or the unlucky because they will drain your energy and your capacity to move forward. So I do keep a full perspective of the world. I'm aware of the problems in the world, but I try not to allow them or individuals or their negativity to impact my world, if that makes any sense.
It makes a lot of sense. Yes. Okay. So, my next question is as I was just learning on this show about the acacia trees and that project, and your knowledge of what's helpful. In addition to that, the tree planting efforts, from where you stand, what do you feel like are some of the most effective actions that individuals can take for the sake of a safer, healthier world? Make things better.
Boy, that's a good one. Um,
Back at you on that.
yeah. First of all, I think we have to deal with the waste involved in our product packaging. And I mean, as a culture, we throw away a lot of stuff. We throw away a lot of stuff, and we are not actually understanding the ecological impacts of all this plastics, the microplastics, all of that. I think as time goes on, that's going to become a bigger problem. So, me being a chemist, I really think we need to start dealing with safer, more ecological packaging,
Yeah.
and stuff that can be recycled, but move away from a lot of the plastics. And
Mhm.
so, I tell people all the time. I even, we drink a relative amount of water. I don't like drinking out of plastic containers anymore, water out of plastic containers, which make it difficult because of, I'm becoming more aware of the microplastics issue. So
Yeah.
I just think in our neighborhoods, just looking around and, if you're seeing, some garbage or some trash or anything else, pick it up. Think about our natural consumption of, of a plastic and waste products and waste material. The third thing that we don't do in this country that is real big in a lot of other countries is composting our own garbage.
Mhm.
And
Yes.
I believe, dealing with the waste and the packaging and composting and composting your own garbage, those are important. There's a fourth one, solar. I'm real big on solar. I'm real big on solar. I believe, we're moving into just a period where almost every building should have solar panels. I mean, if capable, it just really doesn't make any sense to me. And
Yeah.
so, those are just a few of the things that I guess I would call my pet peeves from an ecology standpoint on a community level, not on a global level.
Yes. Okay. Um, my third question is you've brought in the view of different cultures and indigenous cultures, looking at some of these themes differently, having a closer connection with nature. Is there anything in that arena that you can share by way of a perspective or a practice that would feel like an important contribution to this conversation?
I wish I would have studied. Wow. I believe that we have to understand that we have a living, dynamic earth. And if we don't take care of this earth is going to lash back and take care of us and not in a good way. I think we as human beings are totally, totally oblivious to how dangerous and how disastrous s- you know this earth can become
Yeah.
in many different ways. And I don't mean to scare people, but we have between 12 to 24 super volcanoes around the planet. We don't even have to have a one of the super volcanoes erupt. We could just have one of the smaller volcanoes have a very bad eruption. I mean, it could, that could knock out vegetation. I think there was a 15 an earthquake, and I think it was the not an earthquake, a volcano in the year 530. And it reduced the overall climate, I believe, by 15 degrees.
Mm,
For almost a year, you couldn't even grow plants of vegetation anywhere in the northern hemisphere. When you looked at the sun, it looked like there was a haze, or you couldn't see the sun. That's how much sediment was placed in the air. And so I think if we want to be around here a little longer, we have to really focus on taking care of this planet, because climate change, the earthquakes, the
yes.
volcanoes, we don't realize how much damage we're doing. Two other things I want to bring out with this. All of this concrete we're building, the concrete is actually in certain countries like China is changing the way our earth actually revolves.
Wow. I hadn't heard that, but I'm not too surprised.
The other thing, which is also changing how our earth revolves, is the pumping out of all the water out of the water table. So, and we're not replenishing any of this stuff in
Right.
any way. And so I just think from a global standpoint, we just need to be more cognizant, of the planet and the damage, I mean, that we're doing to the planet, not discounting it and thinking people are just nuts or wacko when they talk about things like this. It's a very real problem.
Yes, yes. Well, I thank you for such an important conversation.
Right. If there's one truth you hope listeners take away from this conversation, what would it be?
That that everyone has a role to play. Just reflect on already where your talents, your passions, your connections are, and to just consider if it's moves in the direction of things you've talked about, reducing waste, reducing pollution, connecting with others so that there's a community effort, whatever it may look like, everyone has a role to play, and we need everyone's voice and perspective.
Personally, how do you stay grounded in this work, balancing care for the world with care for yourself?
Well, I'll mention just a couple of them. One is I do try and let my emotions just flow. Like sometimes I'll read, that a policy I'd worked for didn't pass, and I'll just have this wave of frustration or sadness, but I just let it kind of wash over me and not get too stuck in it, but also honor it as being part of the human experience. And then because just a more fun side, because I talked about having an early career as a dancer, I do love dancing. So I like to go dancing. It's a way I kind of shake things off and energize myself. And yeah.
So, finally, what vision guides you when you imagine a future where humanity and the earth are in better harmony?
Well, what's coming up right now is sort of a sense of rather than there being such a big industrial machinery that's running the show, that it's kind of a return to smaller, more community-based, more regionally based ways of living, which I think makes it a lot easier for the reciprocity of, like, if we're growing food, it's not having to fly here from South America to get blueberries or whatever. And then done in a way that's, replenishing the soil, and just we have such an extractive approach now that's creating all these problems. And it just seems as though the way of shifting that may need to go back to things that live on a smaller scale and vary according to regions.
Okay. Well, Leslie, thank you for this deep and moving conversation. I believe this show is going to be impactful and I think is going to touch a lot of people in a way they don't expect. You remind us that caring for the earth begins within, with our emotions, our awareness, and our willingness to feel connected. To everyone listening, you can explore Leslie's books and projects through the links that will be in the episode notes and on the promos for this show. This has been All About Us, where we explore what connects us to each other and to the living world. Until next time, stay curious, stay grounded, and stay kind.
Thanks so much, Carl.
This